we've got to find other ways to provide air defense. And frankly, one of those ways is the F-16s that will soon be inbound to Ukraine. That's also air defense. And we've got newly trained pilots that will be able to fly air defense missions and shoulder some of that burden. But air defense right now is really top of the list as far as not just protecting cities, but also protecting their forces on the front lines and their trenches as well. There's a great need for this.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. My name is Alex Dibble. I'm TimesRadio's Deputy Head of News. Today we are talking about the ongoing NATO summit that is taking place in Washington and its significance for the war in Ukraine. Joining me today is Jim Townsend. Jim Townsend spent 35 years working in the Pentagon on Europe and NATO and finished his work as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO under President Obama. Jim Townsend, thank you very much for joining us on Frontline.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Let's start with the news that President Biden has pledged further air defences to Ukraine. How crucial is it, do you think, for Kyiv to have this sort of commitment right at the start of the summit?
Well, it's critical for them to have this air defense as soon as they can possibly get it, the summit aside. You know, this was in the works for a while. I think it's 4 or 5 Patriot batteries, and that'll be going to Kyiv. And the only way that we're going to be able to prevent the kind of tragedy that we saw with the cancer hospital for children being blown up is to improve our air defense. And I'm happy that they're getting more Patriot batteries, but there's a lot more that's going to be needed than that. And there's European systems too. The French have one. I think UK does as well. But I think that as we look into the near term, we've really got to focus on air defense, because that seems to be Putin's tactic right now, is to try to destroy the electric grid, but also to destroy the morale of the Ukraine people. And we've got to be able to provide them the air defense and a consistent supply of missiles as well to go into those air defense systems, so that we can prevent the future tragedies like we saw over the past couple of days.
Do you think what's been pledged so far on air defence is enough for this moment in the conflict? Should it have been more?
It needs to be more, absolutely. And I understand if I were back in the Pentagon, I would have the Army all over me saying, we don't have enough Patriot ourselves. What do you mean trying to give them all away? I know there's shortages of those right now in various countries. I know the Dutch have provided one just recently. So there's some allies that have Patriot as well. I also know that the Patriot production line, it takes a long time for delivery. So it's not like we all have warehouses full of Patriots that we're not using. But at the same time, we've got to find other ways to provide air defense. And frankly, one of those ways is the F-16s that will soon be inbound to Ukraine. That's also air defense. And we've got newly trained pilots that will be able to fly air defense missions and shoulder some of that burden. But air defense right now is really top of the list as far as not just protecting cities, but also protecting their forces on the front lines and their trenches as well. There's a great need for this.
You mentioned a moment ago the attack that we saw on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, and indeed that came after further air strikes over the weekend that Russia launched. What was your assessment of the timing of those, given that they came just kind of on the eve of the NATO summit?
Well, you never know on timing, and it could very well be that was Putin's participation in the summit, was to give us a opening salvo. But you know, it's not always the case. But the bottom line, though, is whether it's a hello to the summiteers, or it's just part of their continuing gambit of destroying infrastructure in Ukraine and killing civilians. It really is the drumbeat about the West and NATO really focusing on air defense, and particularly as we get into the wintertime. If you remember last year, there was a great fear that the electrical grids would have been destroyed and there wouldn't be enough fuel for winter, and that we would see Ukraine freezing. Well, that problem hasn't gone away. They're continuing to try to make life unbearable for Ukrainians, and they're using their air power to do that and missile power to do that, and And so we've got to really ask allies who have Patriot or SAMP-T, the French Italian capability, and others to dig deep and to provide those systems.
Over the course of today and tomorrow, the rest of the summit, what are you hoping for, looking for the summit to achieve? And should there be more promises with regard to support to Ukraine, do you believe?
Well, I will go out on a limb here and say I'm hoping that the new Labor government, Keir Starmer has just arrived, and his defense minister was here, gave a very good speech yesterday at the British Embassy before a large number of summiteers who had arrived by that time. Uh, he gave a great speech talking about meeting commitments, and Labor was all for strengthening NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Said all the right things, but frankly, I hope that we'll see the Prime Minister make a very strong statement in the plenary talking about increasing defense spending to 2.5% in the UK. And I should not be saying this. This is up to you all. But I've worked with the UK for many years and worked on this problem of defense spending. And I know he wants to take some time off, a year or so, to do studies and to try to figure out what's the best route to do this, because there's other requirements that the UK has, like the US, in terms of defense spending that we do. My appeal would be that we don't have a lot of time to do the right approach. The right approach is to study things, but right now we have an aggressor right on the doorsteps, and the UK has provided a lot of leadership within the alliance in terms of doing the right thing with the military, with defense spending. It's been in the forefront with the US, France too, to talk about the importance of rebuilding our deterrence. And I think that that leadership, both verbally, has got to be matched with some deeds. Because as much as we love working with the British military, and we do, and I have done that, we need to have more of them. We need more British aircraft. We need more sailors. We need more armor, more British trigger pullers, if you will, on the ground. We need more. And they've done a great job helping us with the Houthis, for instance, flying out of Akrotiri, but it's just a handful of aircraft. But they're welcomed and they do a great job. There's one destroyer, I think, British destroyer that's in the Red Sea, which is doing a great job too. But we need three of them. And so my appeal, and again, I really shouldn't be meddling in your domestic politics, but my appeal is that Labor do a quick review. But if they could leave this summit committing that we're gonna handle this pretty quickly because we know the urgency. That's what I would love to see come out of the summit.
So your argument is almost the argument that was made when the COVID pandemic hit, in the sense of there's no time to be doing large studies into this. The threat is huge. We just have to spend the money now and deal with the consequences later.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a very interesting comparison. I would also compare this, and this isn't new, but I would compare it to 1938 in the UK, where the realization to the Chamberlain government was that Hitler was not going to join the family of nations in Europe. He was on the march, and he set off a big rearmament program for the UK. So by the time the war had started, the UK was able to field Spitfires and were able to do a lot of things that really helped when UK was alone after France fell. And so I think we're in a similar situation. Not that I think France is going to fall, but I think we're in a situation where there needs to be a building out program with the same kind of urgency. And again, you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of we've got to spend the money now on things that we know we need. And if there are some excesses here or there, we'll deal with that down the road. But we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, given the urgency of the situation.
Hmm. I'm interested in what you were talking about in terms of the US's working relationship with the UK on defence and within NATO. We in the UK, people like to think that we are a big player, but actually, in reality, relatively speaking, the UK is no longer the big player that it was historically. But how is it seen within the Pentagon? Is the UK seen as a vital cog, or is it within NATO actually not as significant as British people and the British government might like to believe?
Well, it's a complicated question because both in the UK and in the US, we have a nostalgic view of the UK military and the US military. In the United States, when someone mentions the UK military, you think of Spitfires and Churchill, and that a lot of people that's their what they are focused on when you on the street. If you mention the UK military, that's what they think about, and for good reason. And for the U.S., it could be B-17 bombers, and who knows. But for most people, common people, they don't know what the situation is today. They assume that we're at those same levels. But I will say about British military history, what I have found is it's the British military spending has always gone through ups and downs. Before the Boer War, before World War One, before World War Two, and we had the luxury of time, including in the United States. We are very similar. We had the luxury of time to rebuild, and that luxury of time is slipping through our fingers right now. But in the Pentagon, in terms of the UK, there is a lot of UK consultations and working together on the day-to-day projects that the US and the UK military undertake together. There is a lot of I remember standing in the line at the snack bar in the Pentagon, and I looked around, and there was mainly UK people around me. And I said, this is really great. This is a real integration. This is a real integration of our two militaries. It was not unusual to be in a meeting thinking about a NATO thing, and there'd be a UK staff officer who was seconded to the Pentagon sitting there helping us think through issues. So UK does have an impact, and in the Pentagon, it is greatly appreciated. The UK is always with us in one form or another, and when there's a military operation going on. We can go through the list, as you probably can too. The problem becomes that they're not there at scale. There's such as we talked about the Houthis. As I remember, there were like 5 UK RAF aircraft flying out of Akrotiri to take part in some of these operations, which is great. But it would be great if there were 15 of them. But that means having pilots, and that means having the airframes as well, and all the costs that go with it. So what I have seen over time is that, and I watched the UK military since the end of the Cold War, when it was the British Army of the Rhine, if you might remember that term, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller, like the other allies did too. And so I know that, but the UK military has maintained that professional core and that ability to be harnessing the latest technology. But it's just that instead of 3 armored divisions, I'm not sure what the armored formation would be these days in the UK military. So this spending is something that will help UK be an even better partner for us because there'll be more of them. And that's what's critical.
General Sir Patrick Sanders, the outgoing head of the British Army, has spoken to the Times this week saying that the British military is not prepared for a war that lasts longer than a month.
Right.
From the perspective of people within the Pentagon, based on your experience as someone who's been there, observing the slow or perhaps even the rapid, you might describe, depletion of the British military, is that something that within the Pentagon, people who hold jobs as you used to do would be tearing their hair out on a daily basis as they observed from across the Atlantic that being allowed to happen?
That's one of the reasons I'm sitting here bald, is because I pulled my hair out over time watching this happen. Uh, but the thing is, we all did that. It was after the fall of the wall and the Cold War was over. You couldn't make a political case to have a large amount of defense spending. The Russians were not a threat at the time. We're talking about the 1990s. We got into the 2000s and the war on terror, and that was a whole nother effort in terms of dismantling your Cold War infrastructure and making yourself light and mobile and able to do counterterrorism missions. UK did that, US did that. So in a way, we kind of did it to ourselves over time because of it was the political and the geopolitical situation at the time that we were responding to. We would not have been able to maintain a Cold War infrastructure with any degree of integrity because we didn't have a Cold War threat to deal with back in the 1990s, this type of thing. We're having to pivot really fast. We know what it looks like. We know what we need to look like. We know what we need to look like. We now need the money to get ourselves there. And I will repeat again, the US is in the same predicament. Our defense industries in the UK, in the US, in Europe, those were shaped to handle the force structure of the war on terrorism, and now they're having to retool as well and surge, and we're a bit flat-footed, because we didn't wake up to the problem of the Russian aggression until it was a bit too late. We clung on to a rosy view of Russia up until 2022. The last holdovers about don't we can work with them. They left when the tanks rolled into Ukraine. Those last people left the community, if you will, when those Russian tanks rolled in. And then by then it was really too late. One of my jobs at NATO was working with all the other allies to look at the capabilities of all the allies to see if they had the capability to do what NATO needed them to do. So I know quite a bit about all the allied militaries and their capabilities and the political constraints under which they had to work. They used to come to NATO and have to report to our committee and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to meet even the 2% because of this and this and this. And what could you do? And so I think we've been able to get past that now over the past year or so. And that's where labor comes in. And I shouldn't be talking about this, about labor and your politics, but I think labor has been out for a while. And I think labor coming into seeing the state of things, they might have to rethink maybe some of their spending plans, which I know are domestic oriented, just like for Democrats in the US, that's where we are too. But we're in a place right now where we're going to have to really give defense more than their due. And I know politically that's going to be unpopular in UK. I know it. I know, and it's going to be unpopular in a lot of allied countries, including the United States. But we're in a place now where we need to do that.
You mentioned your expertise on the capabilities of NATO member states at the moment militarily.
Right.
What do we have? It's 32 member states, I believe, at the moment. How many of those do you think are in the state that they should be, capability-wise?
Poland is probably the closest.
So 1 out of 32.
Yeah. And the US, you could say that, but we've also got to worry about the Pacific. And if you put that into the equation, then we're stretched thin.
And it's just, when you say Poland, because of the amount of GDP they're spending on defense, is that the only criteria you believe, or is there other factors to take into account?
There's other factors. It's more than how much money you spend. It's what do you spend it on? And I always say, and your willingness to use it. You can buy an airplane, but if you don't volunteer for any NATO missions, then what good is your purchasing the airplane? So, but I think what I would say is that nations are spending more money. That, as you point out, the polls are like at 4%, but they're buying a lot of South Korean equipment because it can be delivered quickly. They've got that sense of urgency to them. So do the Balts. But the Balts are tiny, but the thing is, the Poles are just driving their defense procurement. They're driving their military, and that kind of drive you're starting to see in some allied countries. France, you're seeing it. I'm hoping to see it in the UK. There's somewhat of it in the US, but we're, as I said, complicated by the China paradigm. So really, it is what they spend their money on, and then another thing too. It's more than just equipment. You can have great defense spending. You can buy a lot of equipment, but if you don't have the troops to use the equipment, or the troops aren't trained correctly, or they're not deployable. They're like the Turks in some ways. They're a huge military, but they never leave Turkey except to go into northern Syria. But the problem is that with the Germans too, we don't have a lot of the core problems that are plaguing us in terms of logistics, combat service support. These are some terms of art in the military that aren't well known. But the backbone to a military force is not just the equipment that they use. It is the logistics, it is the intelligence, it's the medical services, it's a lot of things called combat service support that you've got to have to make an army effective. And that is always where you cut first. And so now we find ourselves buying new aircraft or buying other things, but that core, that backbone, I don't think it's being given the attention that it needs. If you don't have transport aircraft, if you don't have refuelers, if you don't have these enablers to help you get to the fight, then what good are you? And that's always been a problem at NATO. So again, it's not just the 2%. It's not just what you buy in terms of end items, but it's also this combat service support that you don't hear a lot about because it's only the nerds like myself will talk about it. But that's the backbone that you need. And an example of that is when the United States goes somewhere, like if we deploy to Haiti in a crisis or something like that, you see us go in, we take over an airfield, we quickly bring it up to standards. You can put in a lot of throughput, for aircraft, and they're bringing in logistics, and you've seen us do that. That's combat service support. That's logistics. That is the backbone at work. And if nations can't do that, they can't get to the fight.
You've mentioned as well the importance of demonstrating that you are prepared to use your deterrence if needed. How
Right.
significant is Operation Steadfast Defender in demonstrating that from a NATO perspective, even if militarily the army and the RAF and the air forces of NATO members are not what they should be? Does things like Operation Steadfast Defender go a long way to demonstrate that actually we are ready and willing to use the deterrent?
That's exactly right. Steadfast Defender was the exercise and the type of exercise all of us were hoping we would see NATO do. We used to do those, they were called Reforger back in the 1980s and the 70s during the Cold War days. And Reforger was a huge exercise that brought over uh, something like 12 divisions from the United States across the Atlantic in like 12 days, or 14 divisions in 14 days, something like that. It was a huge movement of U.S. forces into Europe and then marrying up with pre-positioned equipment and with European allies and then moving to the front lines on the inter-German border. It was a huge exercise. We had to do it to make sure we could do it quickly, but it was a symbol to the Soviets at the time that we were ready, able, and capable of doing this. And it was a signal to them each time that helped us with deterrence. If we couldn't do it, if we'd never practiced it, and so the Russians or the Soviets were led to think that, well, maybe the U.S. can't even get here. That weakens your deterrence. But if your deterrence is based on showing your opponent that you've got what it takes to get to where you need to go to fight them, and you're willing to do it, that's the cornerstone of deterrence. That's what Reforger, which stood for Return of Forces to Europe, Reforger. So this other exercise is along those lines, and so it was, and I guarantee you, the next time that they do it, it'll be even bigger, because it's doing the kinds of exercises that we need to do now, because we've lost the muscle memory of large-scale reinforcements in the U.S. military, in the U.S. Navy. I mean, you don't practice this all the time, and certainly not after the end of the Cold War. So I predict we'll see more of steadfast jazz type of exercises where we get that muscle memory back, and we show Putin that we're really serious.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about the mood in Washington. You're in Washington at the moment. You're at the NATO forum. What are the kind of conversations that you're having with people? Is it all about the possibility of a second Trump presidency? Is it about what Russia's doing in Ukraine? What are the conversations that seeming on the edges of what the media might see that are going on behind the scenes amongst people like yourself who really know the issues that are behind the headlines?
Well, I think a lot of us shake our heads and we just look at each other and go, "Can you believe this?" Whether it's the state of our presidential elections, Trump versus Biden, and the choices that we have to make here, whether it is that we are returning NATO to this wartime footing that we thought we wouldn't see again, wrongly, but we thought that those days were over, and here we are, right back smack dab in the middle of that. And talking about what the next steps are, Ukraine membership, the kinds of things that you would think we'd be talking about, certainly are being talked about, but under this cloud of U.S. politics. And what does this mean if Trump comes in? And that's what's being talked about over the coffee and in the hallways here is just what you would expect it to be.
Has the
And the weather,
conscription,
of course, the
of
weather
course,
here is broiling us, and so yeah.
absolutely. Has the word conscription come up at all in your conversations with anyone?
As a matter of fact, the conversation about conscription does come up. In fact, it came up a couple of days ago. We did a media call here at CNAS, and we talked about conscription. And I think that is more and more on people's minds in terms of trying to make sure we have the sailors for the Royal Navy and the pilots for the RAF and for the U.S. Air Force and stuff. I think, are we going to have to do that in the modern military force where so much depends on people who know IT and AI and things that we weren't worried about in the Cold War days, but are very, really specialists and trying to find those that would come into the military who could get much higher paying jobs in Silicon Valley. Can we get them into the military and the high tech side? Yeah. So I think conscription is being whispered now. Is that a way we can deal with recruitment problems that we all have? All of us have this, including here in the U.S. And it's something that we're comparing notes on, well, how would you do it? How does the U.S. do it now? On Capitol Hill, it's being discussed a little bit. Do we do selective service now compulsory for men and women who turn 18? And so it's being talked about, and talk about a powerful signal. Should we begin to do that? That will be a signal to Putin that we are in fact gearing up, and a signal to our own people. Because here in the U.S., if you talk to someone out on the street, if they overheard what we were saying, they wouldn't believe their ears. That we were dealing with such a tension-filled situation on Europe. But if suddenly coming out of Capitol Hill, there is some new laws dealing with the draft, as we call it, that would be quite a wake-up call. And it could be politically sensitive too. So it's something you have to, at this stage, only whisper about.
I feel like I want to speak to you again in 2 days and hear more about the conversations you've been having. But I know your time is precious, and we thank you for giving us it on Frontline for Times Radio. You've been unnecessarily polite with regard to your comments on British internal domestic policy. It's fantastic to hear your insight, and thank you very much indeed for joining us on Frontline.
Anytime, just give a call.
Thank you for watching Frontline from Times Radio, the interview series bringing you expert analysis on the world's conflicts, particularly the war in Ukraine. For more, you can listen to Times Radio. You can also go to the Times website, take out a digital subscription, and have access to all the reporting done by our foreign correspondents in Ukraine and indeed elsewhere around the world. And also listen to the Times' World in 10 podcast every day. We take you through the latest developments all in 10 minutes. That's the Times' World in 10 podcast. Thank you very much indeed again for watching Frontline from Times Radio.